Provocative title notwithstanding, this is kind of a new thing in archaeology that I claim responsibility for. For many years, we've been finding, archaeologists in general have been finding expansive deposits of trash across plowed fields. And the first time I ran into this was about 30 years ago, and we recognized it for what it was. But over the years, I've actually been gathering data from other sites and published a piece in our international journal, Historical Archaeology, on this stuff. And so I'm going to go through it. I want to start off with two points that I think are kind of interesting. For this particular time period, 1850 through 1950, there are two things relevant to tonight's talk that are really interesting. That is, first of all, cities really just blow up. They expand at an incredible rate, become very dense. And that creates a lot of problems, as we all know, with urban life, crime and whatnot. But the problems that particularly interest me here is that with all those people living in such an enclosed space, what do you do with all the human waste? What do you do with all the waste from horses? Especially up until into the 1920s, there's still most transportation is provided by horses, who produce a fair amount of waste. Also, I was a little surprised and shocked in reading through some material of the period that a lot of horses died every day in places like Washington and Baltimore. And a horse is a big animal. What do you do with the corpse? So we have, with these growing urban populations, we have a real problem with waste disposal. At the same time, this process has been going on before the American Revolution, but really came to a head after 1850, and particularly after the Civil War, and that is soil exhaustion. And by that we mean not just the loss, the loss of fertility, but also the actual loss of soils as soils erode away. So we have these two problems: lots of waste and exhausted soil. And archaeology, in this particular case, actually brings those two things together. Linking the solutions that people came up with to those two problems. So I'm going to talk about a few sites, 4 sites, and I'm not sure how much you could see. It's all cluttered on my screen. But we have a site over in Delaware, which is covered, there we go. Site over in Delaware, the Gert site. Oops, number 2 must be the Selman House. At Cirque. Number 3 is a property up northern Anne Arundel County near Graveyard Point, and number 4 is a site near Brandywine in Prince George's County. I'm just using these 4 sites. Actually, the published work, I think I use about 12.5 of them. This is the Gert site, and those lines you see running more or less up and down through the screen, that's a driveway that led into a house site, and the dashed lines to the right, just utility lines that went through. Well, the site had been plowed not too long ago. Grass was growing up and everything, but we could actually see artifacts on the surface, and we mapped them in. And you can see there's a legend off to the right. We got coal, shell, brick, and ceramics. And so a spread like that, it's about 100 feet by 100 feet. That's pretty typical of a house site. So that's really easy to explain. We have a classic house site we've identified just by mapping in the debris we could see on the surface. Most of you probably recognize the Selman House. That's at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. It's kind of hid under all these contour lines. But this is all these little dots here, shovel test pits. So we excavated these shovel test pits, and then we took the cataloged artifacts, ran them through a simulation program. And what it has done is just shown us where the high concentrations of ceramic and glass sherds are. We found stuff in many of these shovel test pits, but the clusters of material are where those dark red and dark green contour lines indicate. And the red sherd counts, the green are the weights. So 2 different ways of looking at the same material. And that's classic trash disposal around a house. middens forming and whatnot. So this is not out of the ordinary. This is out of the ordinary. This is this field up near Pasadena, Maryland. It's up in the northern part of Anne Arundel County. Shovel test pit survey in the middle of a agricultural field that hadn't been cultivated in a couple of years. And so we dig these shovel test pits, screen the soil, collect the artifacts, and then catalog them. And it might be a little hard for you to see on the screen here because the circles are so small, but most of them are filled with red or black or green. They're out of, 65, I think? Yeah, 63 shovel test pits. Only 5 produced nothing. The rest of them produced 1 or between 1 and 3 little tiny sherds of ceramics and vessel glass, not much different than you would find in your cabinet if all your plates and glasses were broken. So why do we have this kind of uniform spread of material, domestic material, across this area? Notably, there is virtually no brick, no nails, no window glass, nothing that would suggest that there was a building here. So this isn't a house site. It's trash uniformly spread across the surface. Well, across the field, not the surface. And what this represents, my argument, as you will see be supported this evening, is that this is a product of manuring the fields. And there are 2 ways of doing that. You take a bunch of household garbage. And by garbage, I mean organic material, food remains mostly, not trash. What you put out on the curb once or twice a week in a can, that's generally trash. Garbage is, lettuce leaves, uneaten food, carrot tops, stuff like that. So that material is either spread directly on fields and plowed in to fertilize the ground to deal with that exhausted soil, or perhaps more commonly, at least in the 20th century, it was carted off to pig pens and fed to pigs. Once the pigs eat it, it gets spread out on the field as manure. And what is characteristic is, we don't find any architectural material, or very little. So it's not a house site. It's uniformly spread. It's not clustered, as for instance over at the Selman House at Smithsonian. It's really more or less uniformly spread across the surface. From the stuff I'm talking about tonight, it's really a fairly narrow time range. We're really talking about World War I up until maybe the mid-1950s. And also the kinds of materials we find in a quantity suggest that this couldn't possibly come from a household. There's just too many different ceramic patterns. There's just too much trash for this to have been produced by a single household over a number of decades. So these are what I consider characteristics of a pig manured field. Feeding garbage to pigs is not something new. This is an excerpt from an 1822 Maryland Gazette article, and I'll try to read it. Everything's bigger on my screen than it should be. You wish me to give you my method of treating them, which I presume is similar to that of persons generally in this part of the country, and is as follows. That is, after they are farrowed, that is the pigs, the dams are fed with the wash or swill from my house and from the house occupied by the men that work on my farm, mixed with boiled potatoes, skim milk, and buttermilk. These are basically waste products for making butter and cheese. Stirring in meal and bran when the liquor is quite hot. Good meat bran, wheat bran is best, etc. But basically, they're making swill that they then feed to the pigs. So this is a time-honored tradition that probably goes back as long as humans have been involved in livestock, husbandry and agriculture. The process later on is not so much from individual households, but is carried on almost an industrial scale. And so what we do is we collect garbage, again, organic materials from commercial kitchens, institutional kitchens, and those wastes hopefully are fairly clean of trash. They never are perfectly clean. There's always trash in there. And really the best places they folks decided was from military installations. They produced the best garbage. Military discipline. You know, they didn't throw out a lot of, they put stuff where it belonged. But restaurants in urban areas were a major source. But you could also get it from households where that's a little harder to collect. The farmer collects these wastes, you know, brings them from the city in a truck. So you need motorized vehicles for this. Brings it back to the farm. It's boiled up and then fed to the pigs. Now, not everybody boiled it up. Sometimes, very often, I think it was just fed as is to the pigs, which a lot of folks think contributed to a lot of diseases that were then transferred to humans. The pigs eat this stuff and then they discharge it as spent fuel, to put it politely. And what the farmers then collect that manure and also anything the pigs didn't eat, which could be organic material, but also includes ceramic sherds, forks, metal forks, and all kinds of stuff. And takes that stuff, just sort of scrapes it up, carries it out to the field, spreads it out and plows it in. And that is continually plowed over the years, even after they stop with this practice. So the little bits of stuff that's not organic, that was in with the manure and uneaten material, that gets spread across the fields, and that's what we're looking at. I like using this photograph because for professional audiences, I enhance it a little bit by adding figures of prominent political figures, particularly during the Trump years. But these kinds of wagons, if you will, were used throughout the area. They were filled up with manure and then hauled across the field, and there'd be a mechanism on the back that would spread it, much like you might use a lawn a seeder for your lawn today, or for fertilizer. So it's not unusual to find these things, you know, abandoned in the woods or around relic farmyards. Things get away from the individual farmer, you know, collecting stuff and feeding it to pigs around World War I. And this is, I'm not focusing on Baltimore here. Baltimore had this idea. They were taking all this waste, all this garbage, bringing it over to northern Anne Arundel County, where they had a rendering setup. And what that did was it took all of this garbage and through steam and pressure squeezed out fats and nitrates and other materials that could then be used to make cosmetics, of all things, fertilizer, and of course nitroglycerin, which was really helpful in World War I and World War II. So all that garbage could be turned into munitions as well as cosmetics. So this newspaper article is one of several that came out in Anne Arundel County, because the folks around northern Anne Arundel County, where this new pig farm was going to be created, once the rendering plant became obsolete, the city decided, okay, we'll set up a pig farm on 160 acres, the so-called Gibb farm. And we'll just, on a barge, take our garbage from Baltimore to the pig farm and feed it to the pigs. The local folks in Anne Arundel County understandably weren't crazy about this idea, because they knew it would smell really bad and bring in all kinds of vermin. It would just be nasty. And they were quite right. And so they tried to fight this in court. They ended up losing. And the city of Baltimore, there we go, managed to set this thing up on a 160-acre farm at Bodkin Point near Pasadena. In the upper left-hand corner, you can't really see the barge that's come in, but that's a crane that's lifting all this garbage off the crane and onto a railroad, little sort of small gauge railroad car, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner. It then goes out, it's pulled along these tracks, which you can see in the image to the right, to where the pig pens are and just fed to the pigs, just dumped on concrete slabs, and the pigs would have a field day. They weren't boiling this stuff. Now, part of the problem was in Baltimore is that this garbage ended up sitting on a barge, usually for several days, getting quite rancid, getting quite nasty, which wasn't particularly good for the pigs and just made everything smell a lot worse. But also the garbage often wasn't very clean. So there'd be things like razors in there, forks, knives, all kinds of stuff that occasionally a pig would eat and, needless to say, die from. The operation only lasted a few years. It wasn't financially successful through mismanagement, the irregular supply of garbage, and all sorts of reasons. So it did eventually fail, and they went, and I think they went and built an incinerator, not another rendering plant. So they just burned the stuff. To give you, people looked at this, not just the people of Baltimore, actually people, Baltimore City sent engineers out to cities all around the country to look at solutions, and looking at this one in particular. So they collected all kinds of information. This is actually from an engineering journal, Sewer and Water. But you can see Baltimore is listed number, there's the second one there for 1920, which is when they pretty much opened the pig farm, using a barge to get it there and figuring out the cost and all that. So engineers really did a cost-benefit analysis of the whole thing. And then they collected all kinds of data. Again, Baltimore is on top. Population at that time, about 750,000. Years earlier, Baltimore used to ship its stuff out to farms in Baltimore County. And just farmers would want this stuff. I don't think they paid for it. Maybe they did. And it was dumped on their fields, and they would let it kind of rot over the course of the winter, and then they plow it into their fields. So this was not entirely new. Feeding it to the pigs was new. And according to this chart, it was, distance of 12 miles to Gibb Farm, 160 acres, and average number of hogs, 4,000. Actually, they had hoped to have, I think, 20,000 hogs on that farm at full capacity if the city could produce enough garbage. If they can collect enough garbage from the city to regularly bring it to the farm. One of the problems with the system, of course, is a lot of household garbage is stuff from vegetables that are being prepared. Well, during the winter, you don't get a lot of carrot tops. You don't get a lot. The amount of garbage reduces during the winter months when you don't have a lot of fresh vegetables. So the flow of garbage was not sufficient to keep the place going. And they even, collected information on, how did different cities deal with it, deal with their garbage. Dumping is the first column: New York, New Orleans, Seattle. Most of those cities, by dumping, what it meant was they put it on a barge, took it out to sea, and dumped it in the water. And they were doing that for a while in Baltimore, I think. And what they found was a lot of that garbage floated back to the shores of mostly Anne Arundel County. Some cities used incineration, which could be used also to generate electric power from steam. Reduction, again, was at trying to recover materials from the garbage, mostly through steam. And Baltimore did that for a few years. Hog farming, which is what we're talking about. And I'll move on from that. So the big time for all this is World War II. And hopefully, I don't imagine anybody here is old enough to remember World War II, but you've all seen it in the movies and history programs and whatnot. The drives for old rubber tires and scrap metal, all sorts of stuff to feed the war effort, to recover these materials. A lot of abandoned railroad tracks were torn up at the time because the rails were great steel that could be reused. And you'd see all kinds of stuff like this. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Save gas. Carpool. And on the right, I'm pretty sure that's Rita Hayworth. And what she's doing, she's pointing down to her car. Look, I removed the bumper. The bumper of her car was recycled for steel. And so she's saying, please drive carefully. My bumpers are on the scrap heap. So again, supporting the war effort. And included in all that recycling were food scraps. This is an important source and mostly associated with pigs, to a lesser extent poultry, mostly pigs. And so you'd see like scary advertisements like the one on the left, that really nasty looking pig, we want your kitchen waste. And of course the image of Adolf Hitler, waste the food and help the Hun. Actually, Nazi Germany was really big into this sort of recycling of kitchen waste to feed pigs. So, I mean, here you can see some examples of that. Little girl putting stuff into a bin that's specifically marked pig food, waste food. The advertisement, save kitchen waste to feed the pigs. Keep it dry, free from glass, metal, bones, paper, etc. It also feeds poultry. And then the last one, kitchen waste feeds pigs and poultry. Don't waste kitchen scraps. The nation needs them now. Imagine this happening today. And this was probably a pretty common scene outside in urban areas, where you would have a metal trash can specifically for garbage, for food waste. You might notice to the far left, it says bones. So there'd be a separate place for bones, because bones are largely calcium that could be used as well. And on the far right are just bags of trash that's just going to go to the landfill. It's important to remember too that, you know, through World War II, most household waste, non-human waste, was from the kitchen. You know, we didn't have all those plastics to throw out. We did not have an economy based on planned obsolescence, where you buy something from Walmart and within a year it finds its way into a landfill. So there's not a lot of trash being produced anyway. So it was probably relatively easy to keep food waste separate. Electric car, yeah, if you look at the far here right-hand side, that's Adolf Hitler there. And, you know, save your waste food and help to save your bacon. And a close-up so you can really see, although it's quite blurry. 1 ton of kitchen waste per week will provide food for 40 pigs. By saving food scraps, you are saving shipping space on planes, tanks, and guns, for planes, tanks, and guns. And what they're alluding to here is that at the time, a lot of urban waste was still hauled out to sea and dumped, which during the war would have been a real waste of shipping capacity. So what does all this look like archaeologically? You've already gotten a little taste of that, especially with that site up in northern Anne Arundel County, which was actually right near the Gibb farm where the city had its pig farm. And this is the one that really kind of closes the case on what these things look like, and demonstrating that what we're finding in the field is in fact from pig manure. This is part of a farm, the Russell farm, just west of Brandywine in Prince George's County. And I'm showing you just this part from a 1938 aerial photograph, because this is the part we surveyed where we found stuff. Basically, this looks like a ham. And the red line in this image shows the area that we had surveyed archaeologically. Beyond that wasn't going to be developed or already had been developed. And it was a lovely place to work because it looked like this. And the picture doesn't do it justice. It's full of poison ivy, green briar, polyflora rose, and it was just nasty. And it was filled with ticks, and we worked on it in really hot weather. So it was most unpleasant. On the edge of it, this is Peter Quantock, who used to work with me. We did find the remains of some sort of agricultural building. What kind, we couldn't tell. was outside of our project area, so wasn't really a matter of concern for us at the time. This is a map of that area. The blue lines represent topographic contours, so you can see where all this blue is clustered to the right-hand side. That's a drainage. That's steep slopes going down to a drainage. To the left is the area we surveyed. The red dots represent swizzle sticks. And for those of you who may not be old enough to remember swizzle sticks, because I'm not sure we use them anymore, you certainly don't see glass ones anymore, but I put an image of those on the right. So the red filled dots are shovel test pits where we found a swizzle stick fragment. And the red lines represent ceramics. The darker lines represent distributions of vessel glass, but you can see there's no concentration of material here like we saw at the Selman House at Cirque. The stuff is really just kind of spread all over the place. Well, when we're digging this stuff, we're looking at it going, this ain't the product of some farm. This is from some farmer's kitchen. You know, a bunch of swizzle sticks. It didn't make sense. Okay, that's Selman House. It didn't, not clustered like that. All kind of spread about across the landscape, and very small numbers too. Each hole would produce 1, 2, 3 sherds, that's it. But most of them did produce something. And this is an example of the kinds of stuff we were digging up. Again, this is not from some farmer's kitchen. Number one, these are these are commercial wares. They're very thick and heavy. They're made to take a beating in a kitchen. Not usually what you would find on your shelves in your cabinets. The designs were made specifically for institutional wares. For a railroad, for instance, might have its own ceramic brand. And one of them, the one in the lower right-hand corner, actually looks like it's from the Statler Hotel in Washington, D.C. We have another sherd, maybe it's not from this site, that looks like it's from the Army-Navy Club in Washington, D.C. So these are institutional wares. They represent a broad range of designs. Again, not the sort of thing you would find in any one household, but the sort of stuff you would find in restaurants in an urban area. This is a chain of title. I've got the important parts highlighted. We know that Ellsworth Z and Grace Russell purchased this farm, of which we were looking at just a small part of it, in 1932. We know that after Grace's death and after Russell retired from his government job, he sold the land in 1947. So that's really our bracket here. This is Ellsworth Z Russell. He worked for the Department of Agriculture. The photo on the right is from his passport. He and his son actually went down to South America to look at hog raising practices down there. I don't remember where the other image is from. But some biographical details. He was from Nebraska, son of a hog farmer. He was on the board of the Nebraska State Board of Agriculture and its treasurer for several years, editor of an agricultural magazine out of Omaha, and one of the founders of Department of Animal Pathology at the University of Nebraska. In 1917, 1918, he and his family moved to Washington, D.C. area, where he was hired to work for Department of Agriculture in the swine division. This is not a political comment or anything. I mean, this is a part of the Department of Agriculture focused on hog raising. He authored a number of bulletins, reports for the Department of Ag, which are available online, like most things nowadays, especially old stuff that has no monetary value. You can actually download it. And he retired in 1946, went back to Nebraska, and after a brief period, started a hog farm again. At that time, he would have been, what, 70, about 80 years old. Stuck here. There we go. This is an example of one of his bulletins, swine production. Doesn't say anything about feeding trash to hogs, but it just talks about how important hog raising is and how it is a good add-on to things like cattle raising, because pigs just reproduce. They don't generally require a lot of labor relative to a lot of other kinds of livestock. And so this bulletin is basically for farmers. They can read up on it and figure out how to plan their venture if they're already raising hogs or if they're interested in doing that as an adjunct to what they're already doing. I have to tell you from working with a lot of farmers over the years that when you say when you talk about the agricultural extension, Department of Agriculture, anything like that, a lot of them, they just roll their eyes in their heads because very often the agents from those departments have little or no actual farmer experience. And so they take what these folks say with a grain of salt. But I gotta tell you, in the early 20th century, these bulletins were very popular. They're a good way for farmers to become more scientific in their approach to agriculture. This is from an article about Russell back in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I highlighted the one part and I will read it. This is after he retired. Russell was one Department of Agriculture man who practiced what he preached. He bought a farm in Maryland and raised hogs there, fattening them on city garbage from Washington. Now, I'd sort of figured out the whole pig manure thing years and years ago, but while researching this particular site more intensively long after the fact, I found, thanks to the internet, found this article, and it just, it slams it. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at, when we see these relatively uniform spread of stuff that doesn't really seem to belong there, it's probably from this practice. Now, not all of it is necessarily from Washington or in Anne Arundel County. Not all of it's from Baltimore. Some of it came from military installations. Fort Meade was we know farmers who were getting garbage from Fort Meade in Anne Arundel County and used in Anne Arundel and Prince George's County. In St. Mary's County, it's probably coming from Washington, D.C. I don't think we have any sample sites in Washington. We have a couple in Charles County, where it's clearly coming from Washington. So yeah, when we're looking at a distribution like this from Russell's farm, this is what it's telling us, that they were feeding urban garbage to pigs on the farm. They're shoveling up that manure and they're spreading it out as a fertilizer. The bits of swizzle sticks and ceramic sherds and glass sherds, that's stuff that just happened to have been mixed in with the garbage and that the pigs did not eat. Pigs have fairly sensitive snouts. They're just eating around this stuff. Now, we've been developing this further as we find new sites and kind of figure out, okay, what stuff shows up besides ceramics and glass and swizzle sticks? And one we found, maybe 2 years ago in Prince George's County, we actually found a couple of billiard balls. So clearly this is stuff that's coming from a restaurant that maybe is a pool hall too. And it was out in the middle of nowhere. It was part of a farm, certainly. But it's not, it was mixed in with all kinds of institutional ware type ceramics, different patterns. Clearly this is stuff that had been fed to pigs. So, sort of kind of wrap this up. We've got evidence of this practice. And as I mentioned before, you see this fairly uniform but low density distribution of domestic refuse and specifically of institutional ceramics and glassware. Those heavy duty ceramics, if you've ever been to a diner out in the sticks, you've eaten off these things. They have that often common pattern, has a dark green band that runs around the rim of the plate or around the rim of the cup. It's just classic. The kind of deposition that I've been looking at is really into war and immediately post-war. And it is coming from Baltimore and Washington. I think we see this stuff mostly from that period, 1930s, 1940s, and you think that okay, that's the Depression, that's the demands of warfare, needing resources. It is interesting though that it does extend into the 19th. Partly this is what we've been finding, partly this is from interviewing people who farmed at the time. In order for this to work, you need a supply of clean garbage, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction. And by clean, we mean organic matter, no razor blades, no syringes, no all this other trash. It really needs to be clean garbage. You need a lot of pigs to eat all that garbage because you don't want it lying around. It just gets nasty. It makes the pigs sick. You want the pigs to eat that, put on pounds, produce manure, which you can then use to fertilize the fields, which are pretty exhausted from centuries of overexploitation. And you need motorized transportation because you got to get the garbage to the farm, at least once, maybe twice a week. And if you're bringing it in from an inner city area, there's a lot of miles involved. You really need to move that. You're not going to do that with an ox cart. It really needs motor vehicles. Now, why is this interesting? It helps us understand what it is we're finding in the field when we're doing archaeology. When we find these uniform scatters of institutional wares, we go, pig farming. That explains that. We don't necessarily have to start looking for a house site here, especially if no architectural material shows up. It tells us about an important economic strategy of the cities because they have to get rid of garbage, and it's really expensive, as it is today. And an important strategy for farmers who can't afford fertilizer. Fertilizer is pretty expensive, and particularly in the past was relatively expensive compared to the farm cost. And here was a way of basically getting it for free and also feeding the pigs. So it made good economic sense. Now, if you live next door and didn't benefit directly, maybe it wasn't such a great idea. But it tells us something really interesting about what folks are doing in a particular area at a particular time to survive the change, the stresses of the time. So should these sites be preserved? Are they historically significant? Should we save all the trash? These questions remain unanswered at this point. I'm arguing that they're interesting sites and they should be documented. And it'd be really nice if we can get a nice sample of, particularly the ceramics, particularly the marked ones, the decorated ones, because it helps us date these sites, because a lot of these decorations can be dated to within a few years, especially if there's a maker's mark on the bottom of the plate. And they can also tell us what restaurants sometimes or institutions the farmers went to get this garbage. Like I said, Statler Hotel in Washington. We have what looks like an Army-Navy club, a couple of pieces from ceramics from that. And it seems to me we had another one from a well-known hotel in Washington, D.C. So I think we can learn a lot about these things. I don't think they're sites that we're going to preserve forever. They can get bulldozed. Do we save all this stuff? Does it go to, for instance, the Maryland Historical Trust, Mac Lab, to be curated in perpetuity? I don't know. Right now I have a box load of this stuff at my house from different sites, and I use that material to publish the article. It came out of this research. And I think it's going to make for a very nice type collection. And I'm always looking for additional sites that in which we can, get material. And again, look at the variety of stuff. I mean, a couple of billiard balls from the site over near Upper Marlboro. I found that kind of interesting. What other materials might we find that suggest different sources for the garbage? So anyway, that's pretty much it. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
So I have a comment and a question, Jim.
Uh-huh.
The comment is, I've said for a long time, being up here as a Philadelphia Eagle country, that the Washington football team should have named themselves the Washington Hogs or Swine or something like that. So this just provides evidence for it. But the question is, what led to the theory that it was pigs? I mean, what did you find archaeologically, other than the distribution pattern of the artifacts? What got you there?
We found no pigs. Let me be clear about that, first of all. I really can't tell you. I first ran into this on a site near Cheltenham in Prince George's County. And it was an abandoned farm, and there was a field there that looked like it was paved with sherds, mostly whiteware, ceramic sherds, also some glass. And there's just no way we're going to collect all that stuff. It was clearly all 20th century stuff. And I had, I don't know, I don't remember at the time whether I thought somebody was just dumping garbage there and using it as manure, or going by way of pigs. But I assumed it was some sort of field manuring. And it was just, we're talking about over 30 years ago, and I just don't remember my thinking at the time. What really clarified it for me, although I didn't really understand the significance at the time, was that Russell farm. When we started coming up with Swizzle sticks, I know this is not a farm. This is not farmer trash.
Yeah.
And in all those patterns, and I guess I made the leap that this is probably just from pig manuring, feeding it to pigs and spreading the manure, whatever is mixed in. And I recommend the site was not historically significant, so it wasn't going to be preserved, although I think it's still there. And it wasn't until years later as I started finding more of these sites, and I thought, that's kind of interesting, actually. And it's a little known, it's not a well-documented site type. And so, I took it from there, and as I usually do, by writing about this, by, coming up with some hypotheses and writing and, getting data from all these sites, we've got spreadsheets full of data, and playing with it, that it started making more and more sense and started becoming more interesting. And it was in the process of writing it that I was able to clarify those ideas.
And so then the historical research supported that afterwards.
Yeah, it was actually while I was writing the piece on this for historical archaeology. I thought, well, I'll do a little more archival research, especially now with the internet. You can find, newspapers.com, and there's all kinds of information that's available. And I found that little gem of a piece about, Department of Agriculture man who practiced what he preached. It just was a slam dunk thing. And you can't expect to find stuff like that. But even without that, I mean, the evidence, I think, is very compelling. But that's what we're looking at. But it shows how you could take something that's really something kind of, we see the stuff out, people have been looking at the stuff in the field for years and just, it's an artifact scatter, which is a descriptor. It tells you, well, there's a scatter of artifacts. It doesn't explain anything. And it's by playing with this stuff and thinking about it and accumulating data. This is data from over 30 years I collected that wound up in the journal article. It's amazing what you can do by focusing on the thing that people tend to overlook, and you can turn that into something interesting. And illuminating about the past.
Thanks.
Fortunately, no one's started calling me the pig manure man, so it used to be the cheese man because I wrote about cheese factories, which nobody, I built a career out of looking at this little stuff that people overlook and diving deep into it and figuring out there's something interesting to say about it.
We could come up with a T-shirt for that.
Yeah, with some unacceptable words.
So Jim, when you take a look at the swizzle stick distribution on the Russell pig farm area, was that at like 250 feet from one end to the other?
I don't remember this. See if I can.
The thing I'm curious about.
No, that's scale. It's probably about 750 to 800 feet north-south and
Okay.
probably 400 feet east-west. It's a fairly big area.
So then how that distribution occurred was that these, as well as some of the ceramics, were artifacts that the pigs didn't eat, but they got shoveled into the cart along with the manure and then were spread around that way. Is that your?
Yes, spread, and then of course plowed, because you're plowing each year, or at least we used to. And so that kind of homogenizes the distribution. However, we have house sites that have been plowed repeatedly over many years, and they don't look like that. They're still relatively concentrated. There are some studies that have shown over the years that plowing tends to move artifacts vertically within the soil column and not too much horizontally.
Well, it seems with the number of those artifacts that there was a lot of ceramic material in the garbage, or swizzle sticks that was somehow in this garbage, which is a little unusual.
Well, we don't know how many truckloads of garbage were shipped from DC to this farm over as many as 15 years. So it's a volume thing. If you move enough truckloads of material, even if you only have a few sherds in each truckload, it can accumulate to a fair number. I mean, I won't say we have all the bugs worked out of this about the process. It's just that the deeper we get into the process, the further I think we might be getting away from archaeology, which is what I do. What I think the contribution here is that we see these two long-standing and increasingly problematical phenomena: large urban areas producing a lot of waste, and fields losing a lot of fertility. And the solution, we've linked the solutions to those two problems through what we found archaeologically.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, so a speculation on your part. 100 years from now, archaeologists are looking at our trash dumps. How might would they even be interested in it? And if so, how would they go about dealing with it? Because we have huge amounts of trash.
Yeah, I got to tell you, archaeologists have been looking at modern garbage dumps for years. I mean, when I was a graduate student, beginning graduate school, people have been studying it for several years. There are even typologies of landfills, but it's very well documented though, because it's such a big issue today, and the engineering involved in creating a landfill that doesn't leak toxic materials into the groundwater and whatnot. It's very well documented. The thing that makes this kind of study interesting is that there is some documentation. There are engineers going out looking at this and coming up with solutions, but it's not terribly well documented. Whereas today we document the hell out of everything. The problem is dealing with the large amount of data. You know, with this period, we're kind of filling in with archaeology. Nowadays, we live in a landfill of information, and trying to get what you need and sort it out into something that's usable is becoming the big challenge. That's why we have what are called now data scientists. Have you ever heard of data scientists before? The last few years, we have scientists who specialize in mining huge amounts of data. That's how complicated it's become.
So is that the future of archaeology? Data science?
You know, I've never assumed that archaeology will be around more than another 50 or 100 years. I mean, maybe, hopefully, but I would never assume that. That's why I wonder when people talk about preserving sites in perpetuity, it's like, preserving them for whom? You're assuming we're going to be around 100 years from now. Society may decide they could do very nicely without archaeologists. Yeah. You know, we do it without a lot of professions, or a lot of professions have disappeared over the years. So, you know, we too may become extinct. Problem for me, I expect to be around for another 50 years. I'd like to be able to keep doing this over those 50 years. Any other questions?
Hi, Jim. It's Mary. How are you?
Mary. I am very well. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you in this way. I'm back. We'll chat later. I have a question, just maybe this was outside of the scope of what you intended to, document or whatever, but just from empirical evidence on your own two eyes, did you get a sense of what was the predominant restaurant ware? I mean, if they had Maker's Marks, was it Syracuse? Was it some of the other Sterling, all those big restaurant dinerware producers? I'm just curious because I use it every day.
Yeah. The problem is we don't get enough, without really intensively studying these areas, we don't get enough marked ceramics to be able to say. I mean, yeah, we get Syracuse, China, we got stuff from New Jersey, East Liverpool,
Yeah.
Ohio. But, with shovel testing, you don't find enough. With the plowed fields, you have to do a lot of collecting. We had a great opportunity in near Upper Marlboro just a couple of weeks ago, because another group of archaeologists back in 2007 found this tenant farmer site that was, they said, is 430 meters by 300 meters. That's a hell of a big site. But it was clear when you looked at the stuff they were finding, how they described it. These weren't farmhouses or anything like that. This was manuring of the fields. But because it was manuring of the fields, and the county's archaeologist figured that out for herself, the county wasn't going to require any additional work.
Right.
If the other farm back in 2007, they had plowed fields, if they had collected a large amount of stuff, particularly a lot of it's undecorated, but if they collected marked pieces and decorated pieces, we would have had a wonderful database to work with there. So it's really a lost opportunity. That's why I'm interested in finding more of these.
Oh, let's do it. Let's do it tomorrow.
Yeah, because I have so much time.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But that said, if especially if you talk to old, retired farmers and whatnot, I'd love to hear about anybody who used to engage in this practice. If you know of any fields that are littered with the stuff and you think it might be an instance of manuring, I'd love to hear about it. I'll run out and go look at it. And if it's, get property owner's permission to enter the property, I'll go ahead and do a collection. Right now I have the world's foremost collection of pig manure remains. So
Yeah, well, I will see what I can find out and we'll talk. Maybe we can work something out down this way, down in St. Mary's County.
That would be great.